So I took a look at the past Republican conventions to see if there were any lessons there to be gleaned for the current convention. I looked at 21 past nominations of non-incumbents. Those are people who haven't served before. 8 were presumptive nominees who won the first ballot but lost the general. 1 presumptive nominee who won in the third ballot but lost the general. 4 presumptive nominees won in the first ballot and won the general. 7 nominations were brokered and won the general election. Only 1 was brokered and lost. A brokered convention occurs for a few reasons. First, there may not be a clear frontrunner, or the frontrunner lacks a sufficient lead to gain the nomination. Secondly, the frontrunner does not have or he loses the support of the delegates, as happened in 1860. And C, some other force or some other faction controls the delegates or controls the nomination process in a way that upsets the outcome. In examining broker conventions, it's very easy to just sit back and take a look at Wikipedia and try to make some decisions. But if you go back and look at the historical record, there are conventions that people popularly believe were not brokered that were in fact brokered. In looking at the brokered nominees, 7 nominations that were brokered won the general. 1 brokered convention nominee lost in the general. A non-incumbent brokered nominee has roughly an 88% chance of winning the general election. An examination of presumptive nominees shows that first ballot wins with a smooth sail does not necessarily guarantee winning the nomination. In fact, it generally assures a loss. If you take a look at each one of these candidates, none of them won on the election cycle that they're listed in. If you take a look at these 4 candidates, they are the exception to the rule. They are candidates who were presumptive nominees who went on to first ballot wins and then went on to win the general election. However, each of them won with a price. In the case of 2 of them, the branding of the party was substantially damaged afterwards. In looking at the presumptive nominees, 8 of them won in the first ballot and lost in the general election. 1 went on to a third ballot victory and lost in the general election. 4 presumptive nominees won in the first ballot and won the general election. In general, a non-incumbent presumptive nominee has a roughly 33% chance of winning the general election. That means they have a very good chance of losing. In the very first election, everybody was encouraged to get around the presumptive nominee who was Seward. As the convention approached, though, it became very clear that the people in the party were not very satisfied with him. He was regarded as a moderate, and he alienated the radical Republicans. He was called the Demosthenes of the Republican Party and the Republican ruler show. And on the third ballot, the actual nominee, Abraham Lincoln, emerged to be the nominee, and he went on to become the President of the United States. While Seward had the Republican nomination sewn up as an example of how a nominee can actually lose the support of the delegates. In 1876, there were 4 front-running candidates. James Blaine from Maine was considered the presumptive nominee. He won all the ballots, but he lost the nomination on the 7th ballot. Oliver Morton, Benjamin Bristow, and Roscoe Conkling of New York all had dropped out by the 5th ballot. The nominee of the convention was somebody who went there, and he was the last place finisher. He only had 60-bound delegates, and he won in the 7th ballot by over 300 votes in a brokered convention. A poet and a professor named James Lowell worked for that brokered convention, and Rutherford B. Hayes went on to become President of the United States. Again, this is a case where you had a candidate, he didn't have enough of a majority, and the minority voices got together and decided that they were not going to accept the current frontrunner. In 1880, there were several nominees, but there were 3 frontrunners. Ulysses S. Grant was running. He thought he might be able to get a 3rd term as president, and he represented the stalwart faction of the party. James Blaine was running, and John Sherman was running, and a host of other minor candidates. To ensure re-election, the stalwart faction of the party attempted to impose the unit rule, and the campaign manager for Sherman was named James Garfield, and he was able to unify most of the delegates and successfully overthrow the party structure and prevent the implementation of the unit rule. He was later nominated from the floor and became the presidential nominee and obviously President of the United States. In 1884, the incumbent president, Arthur, decided not to run for election, at least not seek it actively. And the party decided to get behind James Blaine finally and run him as the nominee. He got it on the first ballot, the nomination, and he went on to lose the general election to Grover Cleveland, and the United States, as a result of his policies, fell into a very deep depression. In 1888, there were 4 candidates: Senator John Sherman, Judge Walter Gresham, Senator Russell Alger from Michigan, and Senator Chauncey Depew of New York. In order to stop Sherman from getting the nomination, the 3 not Shermans were able to form a coalition, and they were able to get behind a candidate who was a distant 5th. His name was Benjamin Harrison. At the end of the convention, Harrison secured the nomination and went on to win the general election. But at the time, he wasn't even somebody who was on the radar when the convention opened. In 1916, Charles Hugh was the presumptive nominee. There was an effort on the part of the party to put him forward on the first ballot, but there was a substantial competition with John Weeks and Elihu Root. But Charles Hughes was able to get it finally on the 3rd ballot. Teddy Roosevelt also threw his support behind Charles Hugh, and Teddy Roosevelt was of course with the Bull Moose Party. Nevertheless, Charles Hugh was unable to beat Wilson and lost the general election. In 1920, there were 4 candidates, but without a doubt, most regarded General Leonard Wood as the presumptive nominee. Governor Frank Loudon of Illinois, Senator Hiram Johnson of California, and Governor William Sproul of Pennsylvania also had some support, but most regarded Leonard Wood as the presumptive nominee. However, when the convention opened, on the first ballot, while Leonard had a majority, he never had more than 30% of the vote. On the first ballot, 6% of the vote went to a gentleman named Warren Harding, and by the 10th vote, he was able to consolidate support and had 70% of the vote. He went on to become the party nominee and won the general election. In 1940, there was also a broker convention. The presumptive nominee was Thomas Dewey, and he won the first 3 ballots. Second place was Robert Taft. He was second on 6 ballots, but a collection of other candidates stood as obstacles, and there was not a consensus. Businessman Wendell Willkie had been a registered Democrat until just before the election cycle. He had actually been a delegate for FDR in 1932. He was able to secure the nomination, and he went on to lose the general election. Historical documents suggest that he was a plant by the British to make sure that FDR was able to win. In 1952, the Republican convention, instead of going to multiple ballots, the Republican Party decided they would simply suspend voting and let people shift their votes around. Near the end of the first ballot, it was very clear that General Eisenhower did not have enough votes to win, and so the negotiation process with other delegates began to block Taft. As a result of Minnesota, General Eisenhower was able to secure the nomination and go on to win, but it was decidedly a brokered convention, and that instead of multiple ballots, the first ballot voting was suspended and votes were shifted. In 1968, Richard Nixon was the front runner. Nelson Rockefeller was second. Ronald Reagan and 8 other candidates were well behind. But at the end of the first ballot, it was very clear that Richard Nixon had less than the 700 votes needed on the first ballot. So they suspended voting, and it was actually Ronald Reagan who helped consolidate the support of all the other candidates, and they threw their support behind Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was able to win the nomination and go on and win the general election. In 1976, Ronald Reagan ran against President Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination, and it was very close and it was very contentious, but Gerald Ford did get it on the first ballot. What is noteworthy, though, is the man working behind the scenes for Gerald Ford, none other than Nelson Rockefeller, who would have a very long memory of his own nomination being blocked by Ronald Reagan. Gerald Ford did not win the election, and thus we had President Jimmy Carter. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan ran for the presidency, it seemed very clear to most people that he would have the first ballot victory. Most of the other candidates had dropped out prior to the convention. However, when Ronald Reagan got to the convention, he found that there was another force that was controlling the delegates, and that was former President Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford attempted to force Ronald Reagan into accepting a co-presidency, and was only through negotiations on the vice presidential slot with George Bush that he was able to wrangle back control of his delegates and secure his own nomination. So, while it was a first ballot win, it was a brokered convention to the extent that Ronald Reagan did not have quite the degree of influence over his delegates that he thought he had. So as you can see, a lot of times when we have a GOP nominee with a clear path to the nomination, they are not always very successful when they go on to the general. In contrast, we've had 4 instances where there was a clear path, and they did win. Overall, when we've had a brokered convention, those presidents tend to be very good presidents and very successful in the general election. To some, 88% chance of winning with a brokered nominee, 33% chance of winning the general with a non-incumbent presumptive nominee. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and I hope you found something useful to help you in your discussions on politics.